So, some background first. My ex, Thomas, and I have been separated for about 4 years now. We share 2 children together, twins, a boy and a girl, who are 12 years old. Our custody arrangement is something we worked out privately because, honestly, going through the courts felt like an unnecessary headache when we were both capable of being civil. The arrangement we settled on is that I have the kids for 2 weeks, then they spend a week with their dad. It's what works best for his job because he travels frequently, and during his custody week, he ensures that he's home. Or, at least, that's what I thought. About 18 months ago, Thomas got remarried to a woman named Sandy. She has 2 kids of her own from a previous relationship, and they're younger, somewhere in the range of 7 to 10 years old. I have always been polite to Sandy. We don't have any issues that I know of, and I don't interfere in their home life. As long as my kids are happy and safe, I don't care what goes on in Thomas's house. I figured things were working out fine, until a few days ago. It all started when I received a text from Sandy. Not Thomas, not one of my kids, Sandy. The message was short, straight to the point, and honestly, it kind of caught me off guard. She asked if I could come pick up my kids, because she had plans, and Thomas had been held up at work. Now, to be clear, I didn't have an issue with this at all. I was actually on my way home from work already, and swinging by to pick them up wasn't a big deal. But out of habit, I decided to call Thomas to confirm that this was actually what he wanted. During the call, I mentioned that since it was already around 5:30 in the evening, I'd just keep the kids overnight. There was no point in making them come home that late just to turn around and go back in the morning. He sounded relieved and told me that was fine, that he'd let Sandy know. I thought everything was sorted. I arrived at their house, and the second I stepped out of the car, my kids were already at the door, bags in hand, shoes on, ready to leave. They called out to let Sandy know I was there, and she just yelled out a casual goodbye from another room. At that point, I assumed that was that. No issues. No drama. Just a quick pickup. I was wrong. As I was pulling out of the driveway, I suddenly saw Sandy running out of the house, waving her arms. I immediately stopped, rolled my window down, and asked her what was wrong. Her response was baffling. "Why aren't you taking my kids too?" she demanded. I was completely caught off guard. I was not expecting that question at all. I blinked at her for a second, trying to make sure I'd heard her right before responding. "I never agreed to take them," I said, a little confused. She crossed her arms, looking irritated. "I always watch your kids," she shot back. "Why won't you take mine?" That's when I realized this was not a misunderstanding. She genuinely expected me to take her kids with me. I took a deep breath, trying to be as polite as possible. "That's something between you and Thomas," I told her. "But my kids are my responsibility, and I don't feel comfortable taking your children to my house when I barely know them." "I'm sorry." She looked absolutely pissed. She shook her head, scoffed, and without another word, turned and stormed back into the house. I was still processing what had just happened when, not even 2 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Thomas. The moment I answered, he immediately started begging me to go back and pick up Sandy's kids. He sounded flustered and irritated, but I let him talk, before I responded. His reasoning? Apparently, Sandy always watches our kids when they're at his house, so it was only fair that I return the favor. And not only that, Sandy's kids were upset because they had been looking forward to a sleepover with my kids. I took a deep breath before I answered. "Thomas, I don't know her kids well enough to bring them to my house. I'm not comfortable with that, and I never agreed to it." He got defensive. "But Sandy watches our kids all the time. How is this any different?" That's when I paused. All the time? What did he mean by that? I had always assumed that since the kids were with him for his custody week, they were actually with him. But the way he said it made me wonder. I decided to ignore his complaints and just focus on getting my kids home. Once we got back, I made them dinner, and while they were eating, I casually asked them, "So, how often do you guys see your dad when you're at his house?" My son shrugged. "Mostly on the weekends. Sometimes in the morning before school. But it's usually just Sandy." That made my stomach drop. I knew Thomas traveled for work, but I had assumed that when he was home, he was actually spending time with the kids. But from what my son was saying, it sounded like Sandy was the one primarily taking care of them during their custody week. After dinner, I called Thomas back. This time, I was pissed. He answered immediately, clearly still worked up. "Did you go back and get them?" he demanded. "No," I said, keeping my voice steady. "And we need to talk. Why do my kids barely see you during your custody week?" He started stammering, clearly caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" "They see me." "No, they see Sandy," I cut him off. "You told me you make sure to be home when it's your week, but from what I'm hearing, Sandy is the one raising them while you're off doing whatever. So tell me, Thomas, how is it fair to leave our kids with a woman they barely know for a whole week, but you think it's okay to send her kids to my house for the night with a woman they barely know?" He got defensive again. "It's not the same thing." "It is exactly the same thing," I shot back. "And let's get one thing straight, I do not owe Sandy free babysitting just because she watches our kids when you're too busy to be a dad." He got angry, cussed me out a little, and then hung up. Later, I vented to my sister, and she flipped it on me, saying I was taking my frustration out on Sandy's kids, who were innocent in all this. But I don't feel like that's what happened at all. I never agreed to watch them. I was never asked in advance. I was put on the spot and then made to feel guilty when I said no. Now, I'm just sitting here wondering, was I in the wrong? Should I have just taken them for the night to keep the peace? Or was I right to draw that boundary? Update 1. I had spent the entire night tossing and turning, my mind refusing to quiet down. No matter how many times I replayed the conversation with Thomas in my head, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my chest. I wasn't angry, at least, not in the way that made me want to explode. It was something deeper, something that settled into my bones. A cold, heavy realization that made me feel foolish for not noticing sooner. I had never questioned Thomas's time with the kids before. Not really. I always asked them about their week when they came home, casual questions, the kind any parent would ask. "How was your time at Dad's? What did you guys do? Did you have fun?" And they always gave me the usual kid answers. "It was good, we played games, we went out for dinner." But never once had they said, "Dad wasn't home." Never once had they let on that, during his custody week, they weren't really with their father. Now, looking back, I wondered if I had been blind or if they had just accepted it as normal. Maybe it was both. Maybe I had trusted Thomas too much, assuming that, because we had an agreement, he was following through on his end of it. It wasn't that I had ever thought he was father of the year, but I believed he was present. That was the one thing I had never doubted. And now, here I was, realizing that for God knows how long, my kids had been spending their dad's week with a woman they barely knew while their father was off doing whatever the hell he was doing. I wasn't even mad at Sandy, not really. She hadn't asked for this arrangement either. I didn't doubt that she had agreed to take on the role of caretaker because she had to, not necessarily because she wanted to. Maybe she even thought she was doing the right thing. I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I cared. Because at the end of the day, none of this should have been her responsibility. Thomas was the one who had fought for a custody agreement that fit his schedule, the one who had insisted he'd be there. And yet, he wasn't. The weight of it all sat heavy on my shoulders. This wasn't just about the stunt they pulled with Sandy's kids, this was bigger than that. This was about the fact that my children had been left with someone else during their father's time, without my knowledge, without my consent, and without anyone thinking I needed to be informed. The worst part? I had no idea how long this had been going on. How many weeks had my kids packed up their bags, hugged me goodbye, and left my house only to find themselves under the care of a woman who was a near stranger to them? How many times had they sat down to dinner in that house, not with their dad, but with a stepmother they were still getting used to? How many times had they gone to sleep under a roof that was supposed to be their father's, only for him to be nowhere in sight? It made me feel sick. But despite the anger, despite the betrayal, I knew I couldn't just go storming into a lawyer's office, demanding to tear up our agreement. That wasn't how things worked here. Where we lived, private custody arrangements were common, and taking it to the courts wasn't a step you took lightly. Besides, I didn't want to turn this into a legal battle, not yet, anyway. I wasn't the type to go nuclear unless I had no other choice. I needed to get all the facts first. That's why, instead of sending the kind of message I really wanted to send, the one where I laid into Thomas for lying to me, for failing our kids, for putting his wife in charge of his responsibilities, I kept it measured. I sent him a simple message: "We need to catch up about the kids. Let me know when you're free." I knew he'd see it. Thomas wasn't the type to ignore messages, not when it came to me. He liked to keep things civil between us, if only to maintain the illusion that we were still a functioning co-parenting unit. That was the thing about him, he liked looking like a good dad. He liked the title, the acknowledgement, the nods of approval he got from other people when they saw him stepping up for his kids. But now I was starting to realize that maybe that's all it ever was, an image, a carefully curated performance, something he could hold up to the world and say, "See? I'm doing my part." Except he wasn't. I didn't know what I expected from the meeting. Part of me hoped he'd have some kind of explanation, something that made this situation make sense. Another part of me knew better. I wasn't going to get the truth, at least not willingly. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let this slide. Thomas had built this arrangement on a lie, and now I had to decide what I was going to do about it. Update 2. I just got back from meeting with Thomas, and to say that it was an eye-opening conversation would be an understatement. I needed time to process everything, to sit down and let the weight of it settle over me, because despite walking away with a resolution, I couldn't shake the lingering frustration and disappointment. After everything that had come to light, I knew I couldn't just sit back and let things continue the way they were. My kids weren't being given the time with their father that they deserved, and it had become clear that the arrangement we had in place wasn't actually benefiting them, it was only benefiting Thomas's schedule. That had to change. I wasn't sure what kind of reaction I was going to get when I walked into that meeting. Thomas had always been good at deflecting, at spinning things to make himself seem like the reasonable one. He could be frustratingly persuasive, a master at minimizing his own faults, while subtly making you feel like you were the one overreacting. I braced myself for that, prepared for the possibility that he'd try to turn it all around on me. What I didn't expect was just how quickly he folded. It wasn't immediate, of course. At first, he tried to keep up the act, insisting that this was all a misunderstanding. He played the role of the busy but loving father, the one who just got caught up in work, the one who was doing his best. And for a brief second, I wondered if I was about to walk into a battle where he'd refuse to acknowledge the problem at all. But then I laid it out, everything I knew, everything the kids had told me. I didn't let him wiggle out of it, didn't let him steer the conversation elsewhere or brush it under the rug. And the moment he realized I wasn't backing down, something shifted. I saw it in his face, the flicker of guilt, the weight of knowing he had been caught. For the first time in a long time, he had to own up to it. I hadn't walked in with the intent of ripping the entire custody agreement apart. I didn't want to make drastic changes out of pure anger, and I wasn't interested in punishing him. What I wanted, what I needed, was for the kids to come first. And right now, that meant acknowledging that our current arrangement wasn't working. The truth was, Thomas's work schedule wasn't going to magically clear up overnight. If anything, it had been getting worse over time, not better. We had built our entire custody arrangement around the idea that he would be there during his designated week. But that wasn't happening. Instead, the kids were being dropped into a situation where they were barely seeing their father, forced to adjust to a life where their primary caretaker in his home was a woman they were still getting used to. That wasn't what we had agreed on. That wasn't fair to them. So, we came to a new arrangement. For now, the kids would stay with me full-time. No more bouncing back and forth every 2 weeks only to find that their dad wasn't even home. No more being left in the care of someone else, because Thomas couldn't prioritize his time with them. Instead, he would have them every second weekend, and on top of that, he had to commit to taking them out during the week at least twice a month. No dropping them off at his house and disappearing, no expecting Sandy to fill in the gaps, just him, being their father, being present. I wasn't going to let this be a vague promise either. I made it very clear that if his job continued to take priority over the kids, then this arrangement wouldn't just be temporary. If things didn't change, if he didn't prove that he could actually be there for them, then I would be going for full legal custody through the courts. That was my line in the sand. And for once, Thomas didn't fight me on it. I could see the relief in his face when we agreed to this. He didn't say it outright, but I could tell he knew this was for the best. Maybe deep down, he had been struggling with the guilt of it all, knowing he wasn't giving them what they needed but also not knowing how to fix it. Maybe this was his way of admitting, without actually saying the words, that he had been failing them. Or maybe, he just realized he didn't really have another choice. Either way, we walked away from that conversation with a plan, and for now, I'm content with that. I know that this isn't perfect. I know that my kids deserve more than just every second weekend and a couple of outings here and there. But at least this way, they'll have consistency. They won't have to keep adjusting to a situation where their dad is supposed to be home, but isn't. They won't have to keep wondering why he's not around. And more than anything, they won't have to feel like an afterthought in their own father's life. Will things actually change? I don't know. I hope they do. I hope that Thomas realizes what he's been missing out on and that he wants to be there for them. But I'm not holding my breath. If in a few months nothing has changed, then I'll take the next step, because I refuse to let my kids be sidelined in their own relationship with their father. For now, this is where we're at. And I can only hope that this is the start of something better. I've had a lot of time to think about everything since my conversation with Thomas. I walked away from that meeting feeling like I had done the right thing, like I had finally taken control of a situation that had been quietly unraveling for far too long. But now, in the quiet moments when my mind starts running in circles, I keep asking myself, did I handle this the right way? Was there something I missed, something I should have done differently? I don't regret making sure my kids are where they belong, where they feel stable, where they aren't left waiting for a father who barely shows up. But the more I sit with it, the more I wonder if I let things go too far before stepping in. Should I have noticed sooner? Should I have asked more questions, pushed harder to understand what was really happening when they were at their dad's house? It's been bothering me because, in hindsight, it seems so obvious. The signs were there. The kids never outright said that their dad wasn't around much, but they also never talked about him in the way I had expected. Their stories from their time at his house were always vague: movies, takeout, a trip to the park. Things that, looking back, didn't necessarily require Thomas to be present. I should have realized something was off. I should have questioned why the details were always so fuzzy, why the excitement about their time with him never felt as genuine as it should have. And then there's the fact that I let Sandy shoulder so much responsibility without ever realizing it. I don't know if I should feel guilty for her or resentful toward her. Maybe both. Maybe neither. The reality is, I never asked her to take on that role. She chose to, or at the very least, she allowed herself to become the default parent in their household when Thomas wasn't there. But still, I can't help but wonder if I should have reached out to her sooner, tried to understand what was really happening instead of assuming that things were fine just because Thomas said they were. And what about the kids? Should I have handled that conversation differently? I didn't grill them, didn't demand answers, but maybe I should have. Maybe I should have sat them down earlier and really dug into what their life at their dad's house looked like. I hate the idea that they might have been feeling abandoned, that they might have thought this was just how things were, and I never gave them the space to tell me otherwise. I keep going back to that moment in the driveway, when Sandy came running out asking why I wasn't taking her kids. That was the moment everything cracked open. Before that, I had been content to believe that our arrangement was working. I thought Thomas was doing what he said he would, that my kids were getting what they needed from him. But in that instant, when she acted like it was normal for me to take on the responsibility of her children because she had been taking care of mine, I realized how little I actually knew about what was going on in that house. If that confrontation hadn't happened, if I had just driven away that day without a second thought, would I still be in the dark? Would I still be blindly trusting that Thomas was keeping up his end of the agreement while my kids spent their dad's week with someone who wasn't even their dad? I know there are people who might say I should have taken legal action immediately. That I should have walked straight into my lawyer's office and demanded full custody, no negotiations. But I couldn't do that, not yet, at least. The way custody works here, private agreements are the norm, and dragging this into the courts would be a last resort, not my first move. And besides, I don't want to turn this into an all-out war unless I have no other choice. I want to believe that Thomas will take this seriously. That he'll actually show up on his weekends, that he'll make the effort to spend time with the kids during the week, that he'll step up before it's too late. But if he doesn't, if I start seeing the same patterns again, if I start hearing the same vague responses when I ask the kids how their time with him was, then I won't hesitate to take this further. I feel like I did what I had to do, like I set the right boundaries and put my kids first. But I can't help but wonder if I should have done it sooner, if I should have been paying closer attention all along. Maybe someone out there has been in a similar situation. Maybe someone else has had to navigate this complicated, messy world of co-parenting with someone who isn't as present as they should be. I'd love to hear from you because, even though I think I did the right thing, I can't shake the feeling that I missed something, that I could have handled it better. So, am I the asshole? I don't think so. I think I did what any good parent would do. But I can't pretend I don't have doubts, and I can't ignore the fact that there might be things I still need to learn from this.